"That's my boyfriend," Commander Lyra Vera said, and the room didn't just go quiet. It stopped, like someone had reached over and turned existence down to zero. Ethan Blake was fairly certain that statement required context, ideally before it was delivered in front of 36 high-ranking officials and at least one species that considered silence a legal contract. But context was apparently not part of today's schedule. He looked up from his diagnostic slate, which until 5 seconds ago had been the most important thing in his life, and found the most powerful woman on the station standing less than 3 feet away, her long, elegant ears angled forward in a way that suggested focus, not hesitation, and her hand, currently wrapped around his, warm, steady, and absolutely not optional. "I feel like I missed several meetings," Ethan said, because humor had carried him through worse situations, though none that involved being spontaneously assigned a relationship with someone who could probably rewrite his job description with a glance. No one laughed. That was new. Normally, even bad jokes earned polite responses in diplomatic environments. But the chamber had gone so still that he could hear the faint hum of the gravitic floor adjusting beneath his boots, as if the station itself was leaning in to listen. Across the room, a senior officer blinked once, very slowly, like his brain had decided to reboot rather than process what had just happened. Someone near the back dropped a data pad. It hit the floor with a sharp crack that sounded far too loud, then stayed there, forgotten, because picking it up would have required acknowledging reality. Ethan considered several possibilities in quick succession: mistaken identity, elaborate prank, extremely specific cultural misunderstanding. None of them explained why Commander Lyra, who, according to every briefing file he had skimmed while pretending to pay attention, did not do impulsive, was now standing beside him as if this had always been the plan. He shifted his weight slightly, testing the situation the way one might test ice that looked solid but felt suspiciously philosophical. "Commander," he said carefully, keeping his voice low enough that it sounded respectful rather than panicked. "I'm open to feedback, but I don't remember applying for this position." Her gaze flicked to him for the briefest moment, sharp and assessing, and something in her expression softened by a fraction so small it might have been a trick of the light. "You're qualified," she replied, tone even, as if she were confirming a routine personnel decision rather than detonating a social event in real time. That did not clarify anything. If anything, it made things worse. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as the weight of every gaze in the room settled firmly on him, heavy and curious and increasingly uncomfortable. He had spent most of his career being the kind of person people overlooked: useful, reliable, quietly effective, and therefore easy to ignore. Being the center of attention felt like wearing someone else's suit, expensive, visible, and not remotely tailored to fit. "Right," he said finally. "Good to know there was a selection process." A ripple moved through the chamber, not sound, exactly, but the suggestion of it, like a crowd remembering how to breathe. Questions were forming. He could see them in the way shoulders shifted, in the subtle recalculations happening behind careful expressions. Who is he? Why him? What are we missing? Ethan would have liked to know the answers as well. Beside him, Lyra did not release his hand. She didn't tighten her grip either. She simply held on, as if anchoring something that hadn't yet decided whether it existed. And for a brief, disorienting second, Ethan had the strange impression that she wasn't improvising at all, that whatever this was, it had been decided long before he walked into this room. He was about to ask the obvious question, when exactly that decision had been made, when the station's lights flickered once, sharply, like a blink, and every display panel in the chamber shifted to a warning state at the same time. The hum beneath his feet changed pitch, rising just enough to set his nerves on edge. Around them, trained professionals straightened, attention snapping toward the nearest console. Ethan glanced at the nearest screen, recognition hitting a fraction of a second before anyone spoke. That's not supposed to do that, he thought, with the calm resignation of someone who had spent too many years fixing problems that insisted on being unique. Beside him, Lyra's grip adjusted, just slightly. Not tighter, more certain. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet authority as before, but this time it was directed at him alone. "Don't leave," she said. The lights did not flicker again, which somehow made it worse, because now the instability felt intentional, like the station had made a decision and was waiting to see if anyone else would catch up. And Ethan Blake stared at the nearest console as streams of data reorganized themselves into patterns that absolutely did not belong in a stable system. His brain snapping into focus with the familiar clarity that only showed up when something was about to break in a very expensive way. And around him, the chamber shifted from stunned silence into controlled urgency. Officers stepping toward their stations, voices low but tight, issuing commands that overlapped just enough to suggest no one quite understood the problem yet, which was not comforting, because if people at that level did not understand something, it usually meant the problem had already progressed past the polite stage, and Ethan felt Lyra's hand still in his, steady, unshaken, like she had been expecting this exact sequence of events, which raised several questions he did not have time to prioritize. "You might want to let go," he said under his breath, not pulling away, just testing the possibility. "This is usually the part where I become extremely replaceable." But her grip did not loosen, and when he glanced at her, her attention was not on the officers or the displays or even the rising tension in the room. It was on him, precise and unwavering, as if he were the variable that mattered most, which was deeply concerning from a systems perspective. "Fix it," she said quietly, not as an order, not as a request, but as a statement of fact that landed with the weight of something already decided. And Ethan blinked once, because he had spent years being the person who fixed things no one else noticed, not the person who was asked to fix things everyone could see. "Right," he murmured, releasing a slow breath as he stepped forward, her hand finally slipping from his not like a release, but like a transfer of responsibility, and the nearest console lit up under his touch, its interface shifting in response to his access level, which was modest, intentionally so, because modest access drew less attention, but the system did not resist him the way it should have. And that was the first real problem, because systems that did not resist were either broken or waiting. And Ethan leaned closer, scanning the cascading diagnostics, his eyes moving faster than his thoughts could fully articulate, cross-referencing patterns, isolating anomalies, building a map of the failure in real time, while the room watched in a silence that was no longer shock, but expectation, which was somehow heavier. "Okay," he said softly, mostly to himself, "that is not a glitch," because the error was too clean, too structured, like a sentence written in a language no one had admitted to speaking. And one of the senior engineers stepped closer, voice tight. "Technician, step away from that console. You do not have clearance for—" "He does," Lyra said. And the interruption did not raise her voice, but it stopped the engineer mid-sentence with the efficiency of a closed door. And Ethan resisted the urge to look back at her, because if he did, he might ask questions he did not have time to hear answers to. And instead, he focused on the data, on the subtle repetition in the error loops, on the way the system was trying to correct itself using parameters that no longer applied, like it had been given instructions from a different version of reality. "You updated something," he said, louder now, addressing the room without turning. "Not recently, not today, but recently enough that the system has not decided what it is yet." A pause, a shift. Someone replying. "There was a protocol revision 72 hours ago." And Ethan nodded slightly, because that fit, that explained the conflict between old architecture and new directives, but it did not explain why the system was behaving like it recognized him, because as he moved through the interface, bypassing safeguards that should have required authorization he did not possess, the station responded not with resistance, but with something dangerously close to familiarity. And for a brief, disorienting second, Ethan had the unsettling thought that this was not the first time he had done this. Not here, not exactly, but somewhere close enough that the difference no longer mattered. "That is interesting," he said under his breath, and behind him the room waited. And Lyra did not speak, because she did not need to, and Ethan reached for the core control layer, fingers hovering just long enough to acknowledge that whatever he did next would not be easily undone. And then he acted. The system did not crash when Ethan touched the core layer, which was both a relief and a problem, because stable systems behaved predictably and broken systems failed loudly. But this one adjusted, like it had been waiting for exactly that input, and the interface unfolded beneath his fingers with a smoothness that made the engineers behind him shift uncomfortably, because nothing this complex was supposed to feel easy. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind tracking 3 different threads at once: the visible error loops, the hidden architecture beneath them, and the increasingly undeniable sense that the station recognized his decisions before he made them, which was not a feature he remembered installing. "Okay," he murmured, more focused now. "You are not failing. You are arguing with yourself." And he rerouted a sequence, not forcing compliance but aligning conflicting directives, the way one might mediate between 2 systems that had both decided they were correct, and the response was immediate. The warning panels dimming by a fraction, the hum beneath the floor lowering its pitch just enough to ease the tension in his shoulders. And somewhere behind him someone whispered, not quite quietly enough, "How is he doing that?" Which was a fair question, because Ethan was not entirely sure himself. "Temporary stabilization," he said, louder this time, because if people were going to panic, they might as well panic with accurate information. But the core issue is not resolved. Something rewrote your priority stack without updating the legacy pathways. So now the system is trying to follow 2 timelines at once. A pause, then another voice, sharper, "That is not possible." And Ethan almost smiled, because that phrase tended to show up right before something very possible happened. "It is now," he replied, fingers moving again, deeper this time, into sections of the interface that should have been restricted, should have required clearance levels he did not possess. And yet the system continued to accept his input without hesitation, adjusting, adapting, as if his presence was not an intrusion but a correction. And that was when the pattern resolved itself, not in the code, but in the structure beneath it, something older than the current architecture, something that had not been removed, only layered over. And Ethan felt a flicker of recognition that did not belong to conscious memory, like hearing a song you did not remember learning but somehow knew every note of. "That is not your system," he said quietly, almost to himself, and this time the room heard it, because silence sharpened words. "What did you base this on?" No one answered immediately, which told him more than a response would have, and he glanced at the diagnostic thread again, tracing it back through layers that did not align with standard human design, not entirely alien either. Something in between, something shared. "You inherited this," he continued, more certain now. "You built on something you did not fully understand." And the implications settled over the chamber like a second, heavier silence, the kind that came with realization rather than shock. And behind him Lyra shifted, just slightly, not stepping closer, not interrupting, but present in a way that felt deliberate, like she had been waiting for him to reach this exact point. "Can you fix it?" someone asked. The question carrying more weight now, less authority, more need. And Ethan hesitated for the first time, not because he did not know how, but because fixing it meant interacting with a system that clearly knew him better than it should, and that was a variable he had not accounted for. "Yes," he said finally, because the alternative was watching it collapse into something much harder to repair. "But I am going to need access that you are not going to like giving me." A pause, tension, the room shifting again as decisions formed, and before anyone else could respond, Lyra spoke, her voice cutting through the uncertainty with quiet precision. "He has it," she said, and this time there was no hesitation, no challenge, because whatever authority she carried was not being questioned anymore, not after what they had just seen. And Ethan let out a small breath, equal parts relief and concern, because being trusted this quickly was rarely a simple thing. And as he reached deeper into the system, into layers that felt less like code and more like memory, he could not shake the growing certainty that he was not just fixing a machine, he was uncovering something that had been waiting for him specifically, and the station responded accordingly, not resisting, not adapting, but recognizing. The moment Ethan stepped past the last visible layer of the system, the interface stopped behaving like software and started behaving like something that remembered being watched, and that was new enough that he paused, just for a second, because hesitation in front of a room full of people who had just decided you were important felt like a public hobby he could not afford, and the data reorganized again, not resisting, not even adapting, but aligning itself in a way that suggested cooperation, rather than compliance, which was worse, because machines did not cooperate unless they had been designed to recognize something specific, and Ethan did not remember volunteering for that role. "All right," he said quietly, voice steady in the way that came from years of pretending he knew what he was doing before he actually did. "Let us find out what you think I am." and his fingers moved, not forcing commands, but following the logic the system was offering him, tracing connections that should have been invisible without full administrative clearance. And yet there they were, opening as if he already belonged there. And behind him the room had gone still again. Not the chaotic urgency from before, but something sharper, more focused, the kind of silence that formed when people realized they were no longer watching a problem. They were watching an answer, and Ethan could feel it pressing against his back, the weight of expectation settling into place. But he ignored it, because expectation did not fix systems. Understanding did. And the deeper he went, the clearer the structure became. Not random, not corrupted, but layered, deliberately, like someone had built a new framework on top of an older one and hoped the differences would not matter, except they always did, and Ethan followed the older layer, the one that did not belong to the current station design, the one that felt familiar in a way that made absolutely no sense, until a lock partition appeared, not marked by clearance level, not protected by encryption in the traditional sense, but closed with something far more inconvenient, recognition, and he stared at it for a fraction longer than he should have, because the system was not asking for a code. It was waiting for a response. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, because there were only two possibilities. Either this was designed to respond to a specific biological signature, which would be impressive, or it was designed to respond to something even more specific, something behavioral, something tied to the way a person thought. And that was not impressive. That was personal, and Ethan did not enjoy systems that got personal without permission. "Technician," one of the engineers said behind him, voice tight again, "report your status." And Ethan did not turn, because turning would require explaining something he was still in the process of understanding. "I am negotiating," he replied instead, which was technically accurate and professionally unhelpful. And for a moment nothing happened. And then, slowly, the partition shifted, not opening, but acknowledging, like a door that had decided it recognized the person knocking, and the interface beyond it unfolded in a way that made the previous layers look simple by comparison. Patterns nested inside patterns, instructions written in a structure that blurred the line between code and language, and Ethan felt that same flicker again, that almost memory, like reading something he had once written and forgotten. And that was when the realization landed, not fully formed, but close enough to matter. "This is not just inherited architecture," he said quietly, more to himself than to the room. "This was adapted." And behind him, Lyra's voice came, calm, controlled, and far too certain. "Yes," she said, and that single word carried more confirmation than any data he had seen so far. And Ethan finally glanced back at her, just briefly, because some things required eye contact, and her expression had not changed, still composed, still precise. But her eyes held something new, something that did not belong to command decisions or strategic planning, something closer to recognition. And that unsettled him more than the system ever could. "You knew," he said, not accusing, not even surprised, just stating the obvious conclusion, and she held his gaze for exactly 1 second before answering. "I was waiting." And the room did not react this time, because whatever was happening had moved beyond their understanding, and Ethan turned back to the console, because there were only so many existential questions he could process while actively preventing a station-wide failure. "Right?" he said under his breath. "We will circle back to that." And then he reached into the core of the system, not cautiously anymore, but deliberately, because hesitation was no longer useful, and the station responded immediately, not with resistance, not with correction, but with acceptance. And every warning panel in the chamber dimmed another level, the hum beneath the floor settling into something almost stable, and the people behind him shifted again, not in panic, not even in confusion, but in the quiet, collective realization that whatever they thought they understood about this situation had just changed completely. And Ethan exhaled slowly, because he had just confirmed something he was not ready to define yet. And as he began the final sequence to stabilize the system, one thought refused to leave him, not loud, not dramatic, just persistent enough to matter. This system did not just recognize him, it had been waiting for him to come back. The system did not resist the final sequence, which was unsettling in a way Ethan did not have time to fully appreciate, because resistance at least implied boundaries, and boundaries could be measured. But this felt like stepping into a space that had already been prepared for him. And as his fingers moved across the interface, aligning the last conflicting directives, the station responded not with correction but with relief. The warning panels dimming one by one until the room was no longer bathed in alert colors, but something calmer, something closer to normal, and the hum beneath the floor settled into a steady rhythm that no longer sounded like it was holding its breath. And behind him the silence shifted again, not shock this time, not confusion, but something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that came when people realized they had just witnessed something they could not easily categorize. And Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to confirm that the system was holding, that the stability he had created was not about to unravel the moment he looked away. That should keep it from arguing with itself, he said, because understatement felt safer than explanation, and for a moment no one responded, as if the room needed to decide whether it was allowed to speak again. And then a voice, cautious, almost reluctant. "Is it resolved?" And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the word stabilized. He corrected, because resolved implied finality, and he had a growing suspicion that nothing about this system was final. You still have underlying architecture that does not match your current protocols, but it is no longer trying to process two conflicting timelines at once. So unless someone decides to update it again without understanding what they are updating, you should be fine. A pause, a ripple of movement as people absorbed that, recalibrated their understanding of both the situation and the person standing at the console, and Ethan became aware of the shift without turning, the subtle reorientation of attention, the way he was no longer background noise, but something far more inconvenient, and he resisted the urge to step back into anonymity, because that option appeared to have been removed from his available choices. Who authorized this level of access? Someone asked, the question directed not at him, but at the room, at the system of authority that had just been bypassed in a way that felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. And before anyone else could respond, Lyra answered, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty as before. "I did." And that ended the discussion with the efficiency of a closed door, because whatever questions remained about Ethan, there were fewer questions about her authority to make that decision. And for the first time since the alarms had started, the room began to move with purpose again, not reacting but adjusting. Engineers returning to their stations, officers exchanging low, controlled updates. The crisis no longer the center of attention, but something that had been handled, filed away for later analysis. And Ethan stepped back from the console, finally turning to face the room, which in retrospect might have been a mistake, because facing several dozen people who were now very clearly looking at him with a mixture of curiosity, calculation, and something dangerously close to respect was not an experience he had trained for. "So," he said, because silence felt like a trap he was not interested in stepping into. "If anyone needs me, I will be returning to my original plan of being extremely unremarkable." And that earned him a reaction this time. Not laughter exactly, but a subtle shift, the edge of tension easing just enough to suggest that the room was remembering how to be human again, or at least something adjacent to it. And then Lyra moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but with the kind of precision that ensured it was noticed anyway, stepping forward until she stood beside him again, close enough that the distance felt intentional, and Ethan glanced at her, because at this point ignoring her entirely seemed unrealistic. "For the record," he said quietly, "this is usually the part where you explain what just happened." And her ears angled slightly, not quite forward, not quite neutral, something in between that suggested consideration. "You stabilized a system no one else could access," she said, which was technically accurate and completely unhelpful, and Ethan exhaled softly. "Yes, I noticed that part." And for a brief second, something almost like amusement touched her expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. "There is more," she added, her voice lowering just enough that it did not carry beyond him. "But not here." And that was not a request, not even a suggestion, but a continuation of the same quiet certainty that had defined everything she had done so far. And Ethan studied her for a moment, weighing options he did not fully understand, before nodding once. Because whatever was happening had clearly started long before he walked into this room. And as the station settled into a new, uneasy normal around them, He could not shake the growing realization that fixing the system had not ended the problem. It had only confirmed that he was part of it. The corridor outside the chamber felt quieter than it should have, like the station was deliberately lowering its voice after realizing it had said too much, and Ethan walked beside Lyra without speaking for the first few seconds, partly because he was processing what had just happened, and partly because he had learned that people like her preferred silence to questions they were not ready to answer, and the polished floor beneath his boots adjusted subtly with each step, smoothing his balance. In a way that felt helpful and faintly intrusive. "So," he said finally, because silence only worked until it started asking its own questions. On a scale from routine maintenance to reality-bending coincidence, how concerned should I be? And Lyra did not slow her pace, her posture precise, controlled, as if every movement had already been calculated. "Concern implies uncertainty," she replied, which was not an answer so much as a reframing, and Ethan glanced at her, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "That is usually how concern works," he said. And for a brief moment her ears shifted, just enough to suggest something like restrained amusement, before settling again. "Then you should be very concerned," she said calmly. And that was at least honest, if not particularly comforting, and they reached a sealed door that opened without her touching it, the sensors recognizing her presence with the kind of efficiency that suggested the station had opinions about hierarchy. And the room beyond was smaller, quieter, the kind of space designed for conversations that were not meant to echo, and the door closed behind them with a soft, final sound that made Ethan feel like he had just stepped out of one reality and into another. "All right," he said, folding his arms loosely, not defensive, just giving himself something to do while his brain caught up. "You said there is more, and I am going to go ahead and assume this is the part where things get either very interesting or very complicated." And Lyra turned to face him fully for the first time since they left the chamber, her gaze steady, measuring, as if she were aligning something internal with what she saw in front of her. "Both," she said simply, and then she took a small step closer, not invading his space, but close enough that the distance between them felt intentional rather than incidental. "The system recognized you," she continued, and Ethan exhaled slowly, because hearing it out loud made it harder to pretend it had been his imagination. "Yes," he said. "I noticed that part as well, which is impressive considering I do not remember ever meeting it before." And her eyes sharpened slightly at that, not in suspicion, but in confirmation. "You would not," she said, and that landed heavier than it should have, because it suggested that the missing piece was not the system, it was him. "That is not how this works," Ethan replied, more to himself than to her, because systems did not just recognize people without a reason, and reasons did not usually disappear without leaving some kind of trace. "You are assuming your memory is the only record that matters," Lyra said, and there it was again, that quiet certainty that made arguments feel unnecessary. "There are other forms of continuity." And Ethan let out a soft breath, glancing away for a second as he considered that, because he had spent most of his life trusting data over intuition, systems over stories, and now both were suggesting something he could not immediately quantify. "Let me guess," he said, looking back at her. "This is the part where you tell me I am more important than I thought I was." And her expression did not change, but something in her posture did, a subtle shift that felt less like command and more like restraint. "No," she said, her voice softer now, but no less precise. "This is the part where I tell you that you have been missing for a very long time." And Ethan blinked once, because that was not the direction he had expected. "I have been here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the station, toward the life he remembered, the one that had felt entirely ordinary until about 10 minutes ago. "Not like this," Lyra replied, and the words settled into the space between them, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. And for the first time since the alarms had started, Ethan felt something shift that had nothing to do with systems or data or control panels, something internal, something that did not come with clear diagnostics or easy solutions. "You are going to have to be more specific," he said, because ambiguity was not a tool he trusted. And she studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding how much to say, how much he was ready to hear, and then she reached out, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled precision that defined everything she did, and her fingers brushed lightly against his wrist, right where his pulse sat steady and human and entirely familiar. The system did not recognize your access level, she said quietly. It recognized you. And Ethan felt that again, that flicker of something just out of reach, like a memory that refused to fully form. And for a second the room felt smaller, not physically, but conceptually, like the space of what he understood had just narrowed in a way he could not yet measure. And he looked at her, really looked this time, past the authority, past the control, searching for something that explained why she had walked into a room full of people and changed his life with a single sentence. And the answer, when it came, was not spoken, but it was there, in the way she held his gaze without hesitation, in the way her composure did not waver even as everything else shifted, in the quiet certainty that made the impossible feel like a delayed explanation rather than a mistake. And Ethan exhaled slowly, because whatever came next was not going to be simple, and he had the distinct impression that simple had not been an option for a very long time. For a few seconds, Ethan said nothing, not because he did not have a response, but because every response he considered sounded increasingly inadequate the longer he held it in his head, and he had learned the hard way that saying the wrong thing in the wrong moment tended to create more problems than silence ever could. So he let the quiet stretch just enough to think, just enough to feel the edges of what Lyra had said without immediately rejecting it, and the idea settled somewhere. Uncomfortable, not fully accepted, not dismissed either, just present. Missing, he repeated finally, testing the word like it might explain itself if he gave it enough time. I do not recall filing a missing person report. And there it was again, that dry edge of humor that usually kept situations manageable. Except this time it felt thinner, like it was covering something he had not quite reached yet. And Lyra watched him without interruption, her gaze steady, not pushing, not pulling, simply waiting in a way that suggested patience built over a very long period of time, which was, in itself, deeply concerning. You would not have, she said, her voice even. From your perspective, there is no gap. And Ethan let out a slow breath, because that tracked, in a way he did not enjoy. Systems could skip states, compress timelines, rewrite sequences so that the end appeared continuous even if the middle had been altered. And if something like that had happened to him, if his memory had been adjusted, then the absence would feel like normal, which was a problem he could not solve by staring at a console. All right, he said, running a hand briefly through his hair before letting it fall back to his side. Let us assume for a moment that I believe you. Purely as a hypothetical exercise, what exactly was I doing before I became a conveniently available technician? And Lyra's ears shifted slightly, a subtle movement that carried something like acknowledgement, as if the question itself mattered more than the answer. You were not a technician, she said, and that was not surprising, but it was still not helpful. That narrows it down, Ethan replied. I have always suspected I was underqualified for this position. And for the first time, her expression changed in a way that lingered, not a smile exactly, but something close enough that it altered the shape of her composure, softening it by a degree that made everything else feel sharper by comparison. You designed the framework they built this station on, she said, and the words did not land all at once. They settled in layers, each one heavier than the last, and Ethan blinked, because that was not a small claim. That was not even a medium claim. That was the kind of statement that required entire departments of documentation and at least one existential crisis. I did not, he said automatically, because denial was faster than analysis. I would remember something like that. And Lyra did not argue. She did not correct him. She simply held his gaze with that same quiet certainty, and that was somehow more convincing than any explanation. You remember patterns, she said instead. You followed them instinctively in the chamber. You corrected the system without learning it first. You accessed layers that should not respond to anyone currently registered on this station. And Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again, because arguing with observable data was rarely productive. And the truth was, she was not wrong. None of that behavior aligned with the version of himself he thought he understood. That does not prove I built it, he said, softer now, not dismissing, just adjusting. It proves I can read it. And her head tilted slightly, considering that. You are correct, she said, and the agreement caught him off guard just enough to matter. but you are reading it like an author, not a visitor. And that landed differently, because there was a difference between understanding something and recognizing it. And the latter came with a familiarity that could not be learned in a single moment. And Ethan felt that flicker again, stronger this time. Not a memory exactly, but a sense of alignment, like a piece of a larger structure settling into place. If that is true, he said slowly, then something. Remove that from me. And the implication hung there, quiet but heavy, because systems did not erase things without purpose, and Lyra's gaze did not waver. Yes, she said simply. And there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just confirmation, and Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, because the situation had just shifted from unlikely to intentional, and intentional meant someone, somewhere, had made a decision about him without his consent, which was a concept he found professionally offensive. And you, he added, looking at her more carefully now, have been waiting for that to stop. And this time, she did not answer immediately, and that pause, that single moment of silence, carried more weight than anything she had said so far, because it suggested the answer was not simple, and when she did speak, her voice was quieter, not weaker, just closer to something real. I have been waiting for you to come back, she said, and the room seemed to narrow around that statement, not physically, but in the way everything else became less important by comparison, and Ethan stared at her for a second longer than he intended, because whatever this was, whatever he had been, whatever had been taken from him, it was no longer theoretical, it was personal, and for the first time since this had started, he was not thinking about systems or structures or logic. He was thinking about the possibility that his life, as he understood it, had been built on something incomplete, and that somewhere in that missing space, there was a version of him that had known her well enough to matter, and that was not a problem he could fix with a console. For a moment, Ethan did not respond, and the silence between them felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but filled with something that had been waiting longer than he had words for, and he found himself studying her again, not as a commander, not as the person who had just disrupted an entire room with a single sentence, but as someone who clearly knew him in a way he did not understand, and that imbalance was starting to matter. You say that like it was inevitable, he said finally, his voice quieter, more measured, because this was no longer a situation he could navigate with deflection alone, and Lyra did not look away, her gaze steady in a way that made avoidance feel pointless. It was not inevitable, she replied. It was uncertain, and that distinction landed carefully, because uncertainty implied risk, and risk implied that whatever had happened to him had not been guaranteed to resolve. Then why act like you knew I would walk into that room today? He asked, because that part still did. Not a line. And her ears shifted slightly, a subtle movement that carried something like acknowledgement of the question itself. I did not know when, she said. Only that if the system was triggered, you would be there. And Ethan let out a soft breath, because that meant the situation had been engineered, not just anticipated, and that raised a different kind of problem entirely. So the failure, he said, thinking back to the console, to the way the system had fractured just enough to require intervention, that was not accidental, and Lyra held his gaze for a fraction longer before answering. No, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften the implication, just the quiet confirmation that this had all been set in motion deliberately, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, because that made sense in a way he did not like. Systems did not conveniently break in ways that only one person could fix unless someone had designed them to do exactly that. That is one way to get my attention, he muttered, though there was less humor in it now, more calculation, more awareness of the scale of what had just been revealed, and he paced a few steps across the room, not restless, just needing to move while his mind aligned the pieces. You said I built part of it, he continued, glancing back at her. So whoever removed that from me would also know how to trigger it. And Lyra did not interrupt, did not correct, simply listened, which told him he was close enough to the truth to continue. Which means this was not just about finding me, he said. It was about proving something. And that was when her expression shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, a quiet confirmation that settled into place without needing words. Yes, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could, and Ethan exhaled slowly, because the pieces were starting to form a structure he could not ignore. To them, he clarified, because there was always a them in situations like this, someone observing, someone waiting, someone deciding what came next, or to everyone. And Lyra's answer came without delay, both. And that word lingered, because it meant the audience for this moment extended beyond the room, beyond the station, into something larger, something organized, and Ethan stopped pacing, turning back toward her fully, because if he was part of a demonstration, he deserved to understand the parameters. Then I am assuming this is the part where things escalate, he said, not as a complaint, just an observation. And for the first time since they entered the room, Lyra's composure shifted in a way that felt almost human. A slight tension at the edge of her posture, not fear, not hesitation, but awareness of what was coming next. Yes, she said again, softer this time. And then she stepped closer, closing the remaining distance between them until the space felt deliberate, anchored, and her voice lowered just enough that it belonged only to him. Because now they know you are here. And Ethan felt that settle into place, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of something that had been building since the moment. The system recognized him, and he nodded once, because there was no point pretending otherwise. And I am guessing, he said, his tone returning to that dry steadiness that kept everything just manageable enough. They are not going to send a polite message asking me to explain myself. And Lyra's eyes held his, unwavering. And for a second the room felt very small again, not because of the walls, but because of the weight of what had just been set in motion. No, she said quietly, and then, after a brief pause that carried more meaning than the word itself, that is why I said what I said in the chamber. And Ethan blinked once, because for a moment, with everything else happening, he had almost forgotten that part, the claim, the silence, the shift in the room that had started all of this. And he looked at her, really looked this time, as the final piece settled into place. That was not for them, he said slowly, and her expression did not change, but something in her gaze confirmed it anyway. No, she replied. It was for you. And Ethan exhaled, because that answer made sense in a way that was far more complicated than he was ready to unpack, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a realization began to form, quiet but persistent, that whatever he had been before, whatever had been taken from him, it had not been random. It had been important enough for someone to remove, and important enough for someone else to wait for. And now that both sides knew where he was, the part of his life that had been simple was officially over. The room did not change, but the meaning of it did, as if the walls had quietly agreed to hold something larger than the space they were built to contain. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was unsure, but because he was adjusting, recalibrating his understanding of what his life had just become, and the realization settled into him with a kind of calm that surprised even him. Not panic, not resistance, just clarity, the kind that arrived when a problem stopped pretending to be small. All right, he said finally, his voice steady, almost conversational, because if everything was about to escalate, he preferred to meet it on his own terms. Then I suppose the next step is figuring out who they are and why they went through all this trouble to forget me. And Lyra watched him closely, not evaluating, not questioning, but confirming something she had already decided, and her posture shifted just enough to suggest alignment, not authority over him, but alongside him, which was new, and Ethan noticed it immediately. You are not surprised, she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested this mattered, and Ethan shrugged lightly, because surprise was a luxury that had already been used up. I passed that stage somewhere between the system recognizing me and you casually informing me that I have been missing, he replied, and this time, she did not hide the faint shift in her expression, that subtle softening that made everything else about her feel less distant. Good, she said, and the word carried approval, not command, and for a moment, the situation felt almost manageable, until the station itself decided to remind them that timing was not negotiable, the lights dimming slightly, not an alarm, not a failure, but a recalibration, and every surface in the room responded. At once, data lines shifting across the walls in silent, coordinated motion, not chaotic, not broken, but intentional, like a message written in a language that expected to be understood, and Ethan turned toward it instinctively, because whatever this was, it was not random, and his eyes tracked the pattern as it formed, faster than conscious thought, the structure resolving into something disturbingly familiar. Not code exactly, not a standard interface, but a directive, layered and precise. "That is new," he said under his breath, though the words felt inadequate for what he was seeing, and behind him, Lyra stepped closer, not touching him this time, but close enough that her presence felt like a constant rather than an interruption. "It has begun," she said quietly, and Ethan did not need clarification, because the system was already providing it, the pattern shifting again, refining itself until the message became unmistakable, not a warning, not a request, but an acknowledgement. And he felt it, not just intellectually, but somewhere deeper, that same recognition from before, only stronger now, like the system was no longer testing him. It was confirming him. "They are watching," he said, not as a question, because the answer was already embedded in the structure of the signal, and Lyra did not deny it, did not soften it. "Yes," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried everything he needed to know, and Ethan exhaled slowly, because there it was, the line he had been approaching since the beginning of this, the point where speculation ended and reality took over, and he straightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of alignment, because if he was part of this, if whatever he had been before still mattered enough to draw this kind of attention, then standing still was no longer an option. "Then we should probably not keep them waiting," he said, his tone returning to that dry steadiness that had carried him this far. And for the first time, Lyra's composure shifted in a way that was unmistakable, not just approval, not just certainty, but something closer to relief, subtle, controlled, but real, and she nodded once, precise, deliberate. "No," she said. And then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than anything else she had said, "We should not." And the room seemed to hold that moment, the quiet before something larger moved into place, and Ethan looked at the shifting data one last time before stepping forward, not toward the console, not toward a problem to fix, but toward something that felt far more permanent, because whatever had been taken from him, whatever had been waiting for him, it was no longer theoretical, it was here, it was active, and it had just announced itself. And as he reached out, not hesitating this time, not questioning, just acting with a certainty he did not remember earning, one thought settled clearly into place, simple, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. This was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something he had never truly left.